So we're going to talk about criminal justice reporting, and particularly at the local level, and why that is important and why it is showing incredible impact, and what is exciting about that. And I am joined by three people who many of you probably already know. Carroll Bogert is the president of the Marshall Project. Tony Richardson is the president of the George Gund Foundation, and Liz Simons is the board chair of the Heising-Simons Foundation and the Marshall Project as well. Welcome all of them, please. And Carroll, we will start with you. In 2021, you won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for a project that was incredibly local, to the point of involving two local organizations. And I think that sentence says it all. But can you just kick us off by, for those who somehow don't know about the Marshall Project, giving us a little bit of overview of what you're doing, and why that local focus is so important?
Yes, the Marshall Project started 10 years ago as a national news organization. Our founding editor-in-chief was sort of celebrity journalist Bill Keller.
Right at you.
Been the executive editor of the New York Times, aforementioned New York Times. And that gave us a kind of instant credibility with big national news organizations who would co-publish with us because, Bill Keller's running this thing, it must be legit. So we co-published with the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR. But as Kai mentioned, we increasingly also publish with local news organizations, and this story was a national investigation. We built a national database of incidences where police dogs had attacked people, sometimes really injuring them very, very seriously. There had never been a national look at this story. It was always a local story. And what that enabled us to do was to say, here are the cities where it's really, really bad. These are the cities that have big problems, like Indianapolis. We thought the worst city in the country would be like Birmingham, Alabama, Bull Connor, German Shepherds, civil rights protesters. It was Indianapolis. So co-publishing with the Indianapolis Star, AL.com in Alabama, because there were actually a lot of incidents in Alabama, really prompted impact. And I said to Vince last night, I love the fact that this is the Media Impact Funders Group, because the Marshall Project really is all about impact. How do we have an impact on the criminal justice system with journalism, rendering it more fair, effective, transparent, and humane? Okay, I just quoted from our mission statement. Sorry about that. So this really told us something important. We were on the front page of the Baton Rouge Advocate. Boom, that morning the mayor had to have a press conference. Our database showed that was the town, the medium-sized town in America where the most children were being bitten by police dogs, and 100% of them were Black. That was something the mayor had to respond to the very morning that we were on the front page of the local paper. So that really helped us to understand the power of being the kind of splash you could make in a small pond. And we decided to invest to set up 5 local newsrooms over the course of 5 years. Our first newsroom was in Cleveland. That was in part because we have a wonderful board member of the Marshall Project who lives in Cleveland, but also we had serious criteria. The criminal justice system is terrible everywhere. In some places, it's really, really bad. The overcrowding of the jails and prisons, the death rates, the police under federal consent decree, which has been the case in Cleveland for some time. Also, a place where the media ecosystem was really, really stressed. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, I don't know, Tony, if we can even call it a newspaper anymore. It's kind of a shell. There's a local NPR station, there's a great alt weekly, there's wonderful Black radio. We're co-publishing with a lot of media organizations. We don't want to be in a media desert because we need to reach audience. And there was in Cleveland philanthropy available. God bless the Gund Foundation, which has made it all possible. And really, as a philanthropic leader in the city, helped other local foundations understand that the Marshall Project was worthy of investment. So I know that Tony and Liz will talk a little bit more about that. I just wanted to say that we've also a little bit amended our local strategy, or in addition to these 5 local newsrooms where we're going deep, hiring reporters and setting up local news teams. We have one in Jackson. We're setting up one in St. Louis this fall, thanks in part to David Rousseau's help. But we also are aware it's a big country, and practically every local media outlet covers crime. It's the absolute staple. If it bleeds, it leads. And, if we could pause and be a little bit reflective about our profession for the moment, Kai.
Please.
We haven't always done such a great job. We're kind of partly responsible for mass incarceration. The fear of crime, the hyperbolic coverage, the racist coverage, just the fear-mongering. We've really got to do a better job. How can the Marshall Project help broadly? So we're developing a toolkit called Investigate This that will help local reporters with a national database. Here's a database that we have built. You can look up your locality and see how they're doing. Here are sources in your state who are incarcerated or have had the experience of incarceration. Try talking to them about the issue you're covering instead of just the DA. Here's a sample Freedom of Information Act request form. Here's how you can request records. We can help you and show you how to do that. So we hope to have an impact more broadly on the media ecosystem as it covers crime. And finally, I'll just say that, for impact, it's very important that we reach policymakers, that the mayor of Baton Rouge sees the story on the front page of the paper. We need to collaborate with those media outlets. But we cover criminal justice. And we have a responsibility and obligation also to serve the communities who've been affected by that. We've developed the largest network for the distribution of quality journalism behind bars in the country. We have a print magazine that is distributed in more than 1,360 prisons and jails. I don't think Uncle Joe Biden can press a button and be in 1,360 prisons and jails around America because they're local institutions, and we built this network brick by brick, warden by warden, prison librarian by prison librarian. Aware of the fact that about 60% of people behind bars are not very literate or probably can't or don't want to read a Marshall Project story. We also created a TV show called Inside Story. The first season had 8 episodes. We co-produced it with Vice Media. It had 1.5 million views on YouTube, hundreds of thousands of views in hundreds of prisons across the country. Sadly, Vice Media subsequently went bankrupt. So we're producing season 2 on our own, and we'll be distributing it through those networks again. So I just wanted to say that leads, I think, in some indirect ways to impact, because it's sending a signal to an audience of nearly 2 million people who have no internet and no access to quality media that they matter as an audience, that they are worthy of service, and that the Marshall Project cares about them.
So that is an impressive suite of work. And Tony, you, as someone who funded part of this, what was attractive to you about this approach, and why did you feel like this was going to be what would get the kind of impact that you want to fund?
Absolutely. So I joined the foundation in 2022 when we launched the newsroom, but that work had really begun before I arrived. And Marcia Egbert, who is an amazing program director for us, she leads our Thriving Families and Social Justice grant-making portfolio. And how we get at this work is through 2 lenses, honestly. It's the Thriving Families, it's the social justice work, right? And I'll get more into that. But also on the democracy building side. We know that when there's no local journalism, people are less likely to engage, go out to vote, join school boards, join city councils. And so we believe that it's important to build that infrastructure of local reporting. And as you mentioned earlier, Kara, they've been so additive to our ecosystem. And in fact, when you all decided to publish or follow up to what was working, what was happening around the Department of Justice and City of Cleveland's consent decree, that was in partnership with 6 other local media outlets, right? And so Marshall Project had the data, was able to sort of do some of the long committed overtime research and work, the hard work, and was able to sort of share this work on other platforms. And what we found is, after this 7 years after the consent decree, where Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old in Cleveland, was killed by local police, that there were still significant shortcomings in what the city and police department agreed with and that they would do, right? So there's still huge issues around accountability, issues around engagement, and building community trust. That work just hasn't really happened in the way that the city agreed to in exchange for not having any liability or an admission of guilt, right? So this wouldn't happen if the Marshall Project wasn't in Cleveland on the ground reporting on this And then more recently, on our House side of the state and on our Senate side, there's two pieces of legislation tied to collateral sanctions. One being for people who owe child support or back child support, and their license are being suspended. When your license are suspended, you can't get to work. So if I can't get to work, how can I pay child support, right? It sounds like common sense, but to an oppressor, it's not about common sense, right? This is a justice issue, and I really, really look at the Marshall Project as work that exposes injustices, right? And so for us, like, how do we take this work beyond and make sure there's a through line in all of our program areas? And we're talking about education, and you got a school district where there's in Ohio, not Cleveland, let's name it. there's about 40% of the African American boys on IEPs. No kids are taking the SAT. Only 22% of kids are taking the ACT, and the lights are turned out, right? And no one's talking about it. We can apply that same reporting and journalism and amplifying impactful, true stories around food deserts. We can look at climate justice and what's happening with young folks right now in these Justice 40 communities. High incidence of bronchitis, asthma. There's dumping. Homes are being built in places and spaces where there's just issues around the environment and soil. And so we see journalism as integral to everything that we do. It really sheds a light, and most importantly, it puts these issues in the hands of policymakers and decision makers who ultimately can do something about it. And lastly, I'll just share a personal anecdote. I remember being 14 years old, summer of 93. Actually, it was summer of 98. I'm telling you my age, 96. 95.
It was the 90s.
height of the war on drugs, crack epidemic. I'm living in the inner city. There's a raid, and the police say I matched the description, right? African American boy. I'm homeless at the time too, and I get detained and had a gun pointed to my face because I looked like someone who probably should be in jail. And there are so many stories like that. And for the grace of God, I'm the president of the George Gun Foundation.
That's right.
There are so many young brothers, black and brown, in these communities and sisters. They don't get this opportunity. And so I look at it like, we got to not just talk about it, but as the gentleman said earlier, what are the solutions? How do we amplify? And how do we sort of create space for people to share their lived experience?
That's moving, Tony. Thank you. Liz, Tony uses the word ecosystem. And I know that you are passionate about the funding ecosystem around this idea. What is, help us understand that concept and why it's important that we're talking about more than a single publication being funded, but the ecosystem around it that's important.
I'll get to that. I also wanted to say a couple of more things about the Marshall Project and about this kind of journalism. And I will get to the ecosystem because, I guess speaking of the ecosystem, what we've got with the Marshall Project is issue-based journalism. It's real journalism. We're making an impact, but at the same time, we're focused on system of justice, which, if you read the Marshall Project, you see gets into almost every other system, one way or another, including housing, straight-up poverty, children's rights, education, foster care system. So I think that it's so important to do that because, and this also speaks to the ecosystem of local journalism, because, first of all, the justice system is a part of all of our lives. A tremendous amount of money is going into it, and it's really a local issue. Yes, we have a federal system as well, but most, jails, prisons, states, they're in local areas, and what brings people to incarceration are local issues, ways of ticketing, ways of depriving people of their rights, fees and fines, lack of ability to vote in many situations. So these are all ways that we need as a society to be accountable. We need to learn about this. And I think it's interesting we followed reasons to be cheerful because some of it's pretty depressing. But what I'm hopeful for is that that organizations like the Marshall Project that dig deep into issues that affect us all can make a difference, and there can be solutions that are lifted up. As people read what we bring to light, and yeah, we do need to support. Oh, can I say one more thing about justice also, and about the reason why it's important
Please.
that we have justice journalism, or journalism with that lens is, police departments all over the country, they're spending money on what their own brand of journalism. They have huge PR departments. And if you're a journalist, particularly in a place that's not very well resourced, it's so easy to just go to get your information from one of their PR people who's more than happy to talk to you. And maybe you don't have the time or the resources to go around and talk to other sources who could tell you a very different story. So really important. Sorry, do I have time to say anything more?
Well, we've got plenty of more time. I want to open it up, though, to audience questions as well. So start raising your hands if you've got questions for any of our panelists. But go ahead and finish your thought.
Yeah, well, just that there are other outlets that desperately need our money, that besides the Marshall Project, of course, and other journalists who are telling stories that, again, lift up things that we all need to hear. That and especially local journalism, I think, is so critical for all the reasons that we heard from the younger people as well in our first panel. And it's such a worthwhile thing to do, where you could make such a difference in people's lives every day. So I'll leave it at that.
Any questions from the audience? I'm going to ask another one. Okay, go here in the back.
Hi, I'm Erica Evans with Internews. We have a good number of sort of issue-focused projects and grantees. And one thing I'm curious about, I know it's a different space, but how do you measure impact? We see a lot of impact in our stories in policy change and people responding to the type of reporting that we do. But it's often hard to draw that one-to-one line of because our reporting X result occurred. And I'm curious how you measure that and any sort of advice you have on specific metrics that you use.
We publish an impact report 3 times a year, and we actually just published our first one just about Cleveland because the Cleveland news team has had so much impact. We try to define it really rigorously, and it's not about audience. It's not just about we reached this many people with our story. That can be a step on the road to impact, but we define impact in the following way. 3 audiences. Policymakers. Did a law change? Are they restoring suspended driver's licenses in Ohio because the Marshall Project did a story? Now, you're right. You want to be cautious about this. It isn't always just your one story. There may have been advocates working on this issue for a long time. You want to acknowledge that. But honestly, the advocates will sometimes say, oh, yeah, it was you being on the front page of the paper that really made people stand up and take notice. The second thing is advocates. Did we inform advocacy? We should be really careful about this because a lot of people think the Marshall Project is an advocacy group, and that's fatal. We have to be able to publish with those 6 local news organizations in Cleveland who recognize us as journalists, fellow journalists who ascribe to the same journalistic values of independence and fair-mindedness. We're not advocates, but our stories are used by advocates all the time. My favorite story about this was here in New York State, where prosecutors were not sharing evidence with defense lawyers as they should have been. We did a big story about this on the front page of the New York Times. The Legal Aid Society made it the cover of their briefing book in the New York State legislature at that law changed. And it was changed. So we didn't do that advocacy, but we were used by advocates who made change. And the third thing is, and again, we have to recognize, we really do a lot to help other media try to replicate the kinds of investigations we do. If we're not helping the sector generally, it's like an assist in hockey. It's like you didn't put the puck in the goal, but you somebody who did.
Can I just add one more anecdote from Cleveland? There's a very affluent town just east of the city called Bracknell. And it was through the investigative journalism of the Marshall Project that led to the unearthing of, between the months of February to the February 2023 to the end of 2023, there were about 800 or more cases of traffic violations or people who were stopped by local police. Of those 800 or more cases, 69% were African American, right? Now, that has led to anti-bias training of the police department. And now when police officers make moving traffic stops, they have to log it handwritten so that they can account for this. So again, that's huge impact. And I'm not sure if the Marshall Project on a front end set out to get that accomplished, but information and news comes, right? And when it comes, you go out and you ask questions. And sometimes the answers lead to policy change.
Sometimes you read something and it's just so obviously wrong that people rise up and do something about it. And one of those times was there was in Louisiana a few years ago a juvenile prison that was built kind of in secret. Actually, people weren't being told that it was being built, and it was holding children in confinement for 23 hours, solitary confinement. And the kids were literally going crazy in there. And this wonderful journalist, who was it? She's so great. Beth Schwartz-Apple, just wrote about their lives. And so needless to say, this prison was taken down. The children were relocated, and I think we still need to keep fighting for them because not clear. I think they went to Angola. Is that right? Yeah. So it's like the fight goes on, but you read about these things, you just have to act sometimes.
Yeah. Another question from the audience?
I'm a little biased. When I was at the Cleveland Foundation, we helped fund the Marshall Project, and we think they are amazing. And I'm really curious, now that you've been there for a little bit, the reaction from judges. Because we are finding in a lot of places they are some of the, even more than police, really hard to change, to educate, to get them to think differently. So I'm kind of curious about what's been happening on that.
Dale, I want to say, honestly, your leadership in Cleveland, along with Tony, has been determinative for nonprofit media in that city, and you're changing that city, and now you're going to change the country as the head of Press Forward. So bless you for everything you're doing.
No pressure, Dale.
Yeah, no pressure. She's got it, man. If Dale's in charge, it'll get done. Yeah, when we did our feasibility study into Cleveland, which of course the Cleveland Foundation was a part of, we had judges say to us, I have no idea how my sentencing stacks up against the other 33 judges in the Cuyahoga County criminal court system. Like, I don't even data telling me about how I'm doing my job. So our first project there was to really dig into that data. The Cuyahoga County court system did everything in its power to keep us from getting what should be publicly available data. I mean, they built walls to prevent us from scraping the data. It's a long story, but a year to get the data and to analyze it and to publish it. But what we really found in that process was that the voting patterns, to put it bluntly, the suburbs of Cleveland were electing the judges who were sending the residents of the city to prison.
Right.
And for that reason, this year we published a judge's guide. This is something I wish we had in New York. I don't know, do you guys have judge's guide? Don't you go into the ballot box and look at the list of judges and say, holy moly, who are these people? Yeah. Excellent. So we did that in Cleveland just to give people the information about who these people are, and we co-published it with local media. We distributed on flyers at barbershops and food banks and community centers. We bought ads in bus shelters in the zip codes that were voting least for judges. We bought an ad on the bus shelter right outside the Cuyahoga County court system, so you can come right out of the court and see a little ad there saying, want to know more about your judge? So I can't tell you, Dale, that we changed voting patterns in Cleveland in the primary in March, but there's a general election in the fall, and we intend to keep at it. I know that Injustice Watch in Chicago, where Jamie Alter's been so active, has had a great success. We really try to copy what they've done. It's something that needs to happen in every city in America.
And Tony, as in our last couple minutes here, if you want to add to that about judges in Cleveland, but can you also say a word about whether or not this strategy of feeding into the local ecosystem in media, whether you're seeing the echo effect of it beyond just the specific Marshall Project reporting?
No, absolutely. And we continue to see Signal Cleveland Now it's continuing to grow its audience and subscribers. And just outside of Cleveland, you have the Youngstown Vindicator that no longer exists, right? And so when we think about the region, or you go over to Lorain County, they have very, very few reporters and smaller newsrooms. So we're seeing a lot of the journalism starting to really permeate throughout the broader region. And you're getting more stories from those communities as well, which is interesting and cool. And we're attracting more funders, believe it or not, who are interested, asking more questions, who want to invest because they understand. And so, but in those particular instances, we've engaged them around the democracy building side of it, not so much the journalism side, right? Which to me, it all goes together. But with funders, you got to tell them what they want to hear. So
who's the they in this?
Right. Yeah, right.
We got to leave it there. Tony Richardson, Carroll Bogert, Liz Simons, thank you so very much.